Colombia, another place, a place of hope, if that's what you're looking for. Very happy to be joined here by our good friend Zoe Alexandra, who's the co-editor of People's Dispatch, among many other things, covering social movements and left politics, quite frankly, all around the world, but certainly in Latin America and the Caribbean. Zoe, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
No, the pleasure is all ours. Colombia, of course, went through a pretty significant change with Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez becoming president and vice president, respectively there. Of course, ending the reign of the narco dictatorship that had been there for quite some time. So we wanted to check in and see more or less how things were going. I know there have been a number of progressive initiatives that have been forwarded and taken place already, including around healthcare and other things. And I mean, maybe if you could just to open up, I mean, have we seen the sort of at least even some turning of the page in terms of the nature of the politics of Colombia that I think people were looking for after this election?
We definitely have seen that. I mean, in all areas of politics, of economics, of social life, I mean, the government of Gustavo Petro has been a complete shift. I mean, for example, in the international realm, which we've talked about a lot on this show, and especially we've covered it at People's Dispatch, rekindling the ties between Venezuela and Colombia, Colombia becoming a bigger actor in the regional stage, advocating for Cuba. I mean, these sound like small details, but they're actually huge shifts for the region and have definitely had an enormous impact on how policy happens within the region, what the U.S. is actually able to get away with in the region, the fact that it doesn't have Colombia as its major ally in its international plots is a huge, important thing to recognize. And then, of course, in the social and economic area, which is really the most pressing, which is why so many people actually voted for this government of change, voted for Colombia Humana, voted for Gustavo Petro, Francia Marquez, people who are intimately tied to the movements in the country. Francia Marquez hailing from the Black communities process, from Cauca, who is very deeply involved in a struggle against illegal mining in her territory. Gustavo Petro, who was the mayor of Bogota and enacted many, many social policies. He also was active in the left-wing armed group in the 80s and 90s. And so these are people who know very well all of the social and economic problems facing the country. They are no strangers to how capitalism has really ravaged Colombia, how imperialism has ravaged Colombia, the fact that students are not able to study. And so this has been one of their primary areas. And so basically, the main focus of Petro's government has been pushing forward the agrarian reform, healthcare reform, labor reform, and pension reform. And so these are notoriously sticky areas, and especially in Colombia. The healthcare, for example, the reform that they're trying to enact there is of vital importance because in Colombia, it's one of those countries that the saying about the healthcare system is that you die at the doors of the hospital before you get treated. That is how inefficient the system is. It runs through a series of kind of third-party providers, the EPSs, and it essentially channelizes a lot of money towards private insurance companies and leaves a lot of people without care. This is something we're very familiar with in the United States. And so that's why this was one of the key areas that Gustavo Petro wanted to reform. Why is all of this money going to the private sector and people are getting without healthcare? So they've been pushing through the healthcare reform, labor reform, similarly trying to guarantee some really basic rights for workers, supporting, for example, the initiatives of different trade unions in the country, pension reform, trying to make that more humane for retired people in the country. Again, a lot of these areas are dominated by the private sector, where the private sector has a lot of benefits. And so there's been subtle shifts to try to bring that back into the public sphere. And so he's faced enormous pushback from members of Congress and from other right-wing sectors who have been mobilizing. And he has actually called on his supporters to really take to the streets in a couple of different instances to support these reforms, which, again, he was really elected on this platform of healthcare, education, workers' rights, and pension reform, which is, of course, a really hot button issue today in the world.
And then, Zoe, another change in Colombia has been the resumption of these peace talks with the ELN. And this, of course, was initially what got Cuba placed on the state sponsor of terrorism list, or the U.S. used it for that years ago under Donald Trump because they were hosting these talks. But they started hosting them again. There was, I think, talks earlier this month that took place. Why is the resumption of these negotiations so significant?
Well, this is another area where the right wing has really been pushing back. So another key area, the key platform of Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez is this plan for total peace. And so for people who don't follow Colombian politics, it has been plagued with 6 decades armed conflict between left-wing guerrilla groups and, of course, the central government, fighting over basic things. I mean, these same things that the left-wing government now wants to actually enact, which is having access to land, having many different of the natural resources that Colombia has under public control. These have been some of the key motivating factors for the internal armed conflict in Colombia. And in the 21st century, there were impressive advances in peace under Juan Manuel Santos, who was the successor of Álvaro Uribe Vélez. There were peace talks started and completed with the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, which took place in Havana. And peace talks were also started with the National Liberation Army, the ELN. This was started at the end of Santos's term, and the hope was that these peace talks would continue once Ivan Duque took office. But they suffered a series of misfalls. They were originally hosted in Ecuador, and when Lenin Moreno took office and essentially turned on the citizens' revolution, one of the first things he did was to say that Ecuador would no longer host these peace talks. And so Cuba, because it in this peace talks with the ELN was a guarantor country, which means that they are one of the countries that's supporting this process, said that they would again host another peace process. However, then when Ivan Duque was sworn in, this process was abruptly put to an end, halted. They never sent a government delegation to Havana, and instead they issued a Interpol warning. And this is essentially in complete violation of peace agreement protocol. I mean, there's been peace agreements across the world, and the number one thing you can't do is actually demand the arrest of a team that's been part of a process that has been sanctioned by Norway, sanctioned by so many other countries, that has actually rules and that protocol that you have to follow. And so Ivan Duque, being the extreme right-wing pundit that he is, he demanded that they be extradited. And this, of course, set off this whole saga, which we now know of Cuba being accused of being a state sponsor of terrorism. Gustavo Petro, in addition to returning to peace talks with the ELN, which again is so important given the history of 6 decades of armed conflict that Colombia has had to face, returning to peace talks, not only bringing peace back to the country, putting it back on the table as a central priority, he also called for Cuba to be taken off the state sponsors of terrorism list, recognizing the role that Cuba has played in all of these different peace processes. But also he's engaged in peace processes and tried to engage with other armed groups in the country. There's a number of paramilitary groups, of narco trafficking groups, of drug trafficking groups, that have control over a lot of large areas of land in Colombia that today are responsible for carrying out a lot of the assassinations of social leaders, of community leaders. He's also tried to engage with them because while the right wing has said the only way to deal with crime and to deal with these guerrilla groups is annihilation, is just killing them or ignoring that they exist, Gustavo Petro's government has said, we actually have to come to the table with these people. We have to figure out actually how to make this country a better place. And so the peace talks with the ELN are underway. There was also a cycle that was held in Mexico earlier this year. They're advancing, and they're trying to reach currently the bilateral ceasefire. This could be a huge step for the country. It is currently the largest armed group active in the country. And so the possibility of total peace is something that cannot be undermined.
No, I think it's a good point. It actually sort of segues something you just said into the question I wanted to ask you, which is sort of maybe combining the issue of the pushback to Petro and the political scene and what we've seen from groups like, say, the Gulf Clan, who are obviously using, armed force to express their dissatisfaction with elements of the Petro government. And of course, for years, I mean, this sort of connection between, sort of the right wing of politics and the paramilitary movement was sort of a parallel way of preventing progressive change in the country. So, I mean, I wonder if there's still fears here that, in a way, it'll be difficult to engage some of those armed groups in peace conflicts because to some degree they're engaging in the armed action as part of a political strategy.
I mean, Petro is definitely in a very, very difficult situation. We reported People's Dispatch about the mobilization of hundreds of retired members of the military. Of course, active members of the military are prohibited from participating in any sort of political mobilization. And they were on the streets in big numbers, mobilizing specifically against Petro's plan for peace and his reforms to the healthcare system, et cetera. And they were actually, there was comments made by one of the retired members of the armed forces the next day that said that they were this was following in the steps of Peru, and that someday maybe soon they would be able to defenestrate the corrupt guerrilla president that they had, Gustavo Petro. And so he's really facing a very difficult situation. This coup attempt is just one sign of the fact that, of course, just because you get elected president does not mean that these forces of evil, in some ways, these forces that really want to bring Colombia back to the dark ages, that don't believe in its progress, its development, in the fact that it should take care of the environment, engage in peace. All of these forces are not sitting back quietly. And one of the leaders of the opposition, Maria Fernanda Cabal, has been extremely active. She's sort of the successor to Uribe in some ways. She even traveled to Spain, met with the Vox party during their election campaign, and saying how grateful she is that the Vox party, the fascist right-wing party in Spain, is actually paying attention to Latin America and saving it, helping in its struggle against communism and against these corrupt people. And so there's many, many different forces that the government is having to grapple with. And of course, these paramilitary groups continue to be a key threat. I mean, during Petro and Francia's presidential campaign, they both received serious threats from these groups. At the end of the campaign, they would be on stage with bulletproof shields, protecting them while they're at these, multi-thousand member events and rallies. They have had to deal with a lot of these difficulties. And this definitely isn't going away. But of course, the current approach of the government that was taken, which was to ignore it and also to collaborate with the government of Iván Duque. There's many different links that have been proven that he had support and was working with some of these illegal armed groups. This, of course, was not the way to deal with these groups, and they only, got stronger under his government. And so he's trying out this approach, but I think it's going to be a long road. 60 years of armed conflict, internal armed conflict, does not go away with a 4-year presidency. And he's making incredible strides, but this is going to be a long process. And really re-educating all of Colombian society in a way of reorienting the culture, a culture that's been really based around this informal, to say it like that, sector of the economy, of drug trafficking, of all these different economies and societies that have really developed around that. And so it's a tremendous task that he's facing. But I think that really insisting on peace and humanity and putting the needs of the most vulnerable Colombians is definitely the way to go.
Speaking of which, in Colombia, the term limit is 4 years and you don't get to have another term. So it's also like running against the clock as well. I mean, there's so much to change, right, in such a short amount of time. So I'm just curious, is this a conversation that like progressive forces in Colombia are having in terms of like, how do we sustain this, I guess, movement beyond just these 4 years?
Well, there is 2 terms, but
I'm sorry. I thought Colombia only had one. I take it back, and I'm so sorry if I scared anyone.
Well, you know what? We stay sharp. But I think that a key element and something that across the region people are grappling with is what to do when you have a progressive government that is operating in the confines of a bourgeois democracy that has all of the limits of not really being able to shape the base of the economy of, Petro himself has said, I am not against capitalism. He's not going to fundamentally change the capitalist system. This means that there's always going to exist these kind of contradictions within his government. And a major question across the region, as I said, in Brazil, in all of these countries where you have progressive governments, is how do movements maintain their autonomy? How do they respond? And how do they continue to grow in this moment where there's more openings, when there's more possibilities of people being more favorable to leftist and progressive ideas, but maybe where people feel like they're kind of set, they're demobilized, there's not something to drive them out onto the streets. And so I think this is something that the left and that movements in Colombia are grappling with. For decades, for 6 decades, they've been on defense. They've been, fighting for their lives, literally fighting extinction. And so now it's a moment of trying to rebuild and supporting, for example, I think the example of calling for mobilizations to support the reforms that are put forth by the government is such an important tactic that Petro is using to make sure that the streets are also supporting his government. He doesn't land in a situation where he is completely divorced from the movements, like maybe what happened in Chile with Boric and the left movements there, or with Pedro Castillo when it came time for his impeachment for the coup against him. He was essentially alone. He didn't have the support of the streets. He didn't have the force of the people to really reject these political maneuvers by the right wing. So I think there's constantly being lessons learned. I think what's happening in Mexico with Andrés Manuel López Obrador is also a very, very interesting case of really using the power and the support he has of the people. I mean, AMLO has a 70% approval rating. He has the people. He might not have the control and support of the oligarchs, but he can use the mass mobilization of people to gain momentum behind progressive politics.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Zoe, very comprehensive reporting on Colombia, like everywhere else. Really appreciate you giving us some of your time. And I hope everybody is regularly reading People's Dispatch, which is always being updated at all times of the day and night. So a great source for news on social movements around the world. But thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.